I decided to analyze how realistic the lawmen in Red Dead 2 really are. All of this, so you can find out if they're as smart as people say on the internet. Is the police actually realistic? Are the uniforms they wear accurate to what was used back then? Do they have the kind of intelligence to organize themselves like bounty hunters did in that era? Do the lawmen actually respect state borders in Red Dead 2? We also need to know, did the Pinkertons really exist in the Old West? And what was the sheriff's role in an Old West town? I went through hundreds of files online and even got the opinion of an Old West expert. All of this to help us uncover what law enforcement was really like during the golden age of American gunslingers. That and a bunch of other curiosities we're diving into in this video. Starting with the authorities, there's a detail most people don't know that Red Dead 2 totally gets right. Back then, many lawmen didn't wear uniforms at all. The only way to identify them was by the badges, just like we see on the lawmen here. And yes, that's historically accurate. Real-life sheriffs and deputies dressed just like regular citizens. The only thing that set them apart was the badge, which, as you can imagine, caused all kinds of problems during shootouts. It was hard to tell who was a fellow officer and who was an outlaw. And I don't even mention the kind of trouble that could lead to. Beyond the cosmetic accuracy that Red Dead 2 gets right, the AI of the NPCs can be pretty smart too. They look for cover, they try to flank you, and they shoot in a coordinated way. A lot of times, cops in big cities like Saint Denis even organize themselves and blow whistles to form up. You can even hear whistles, which were kind of like commands coming from someone higher up in the chain of command. What's most interesting is that you only hear those whistles when there's a large group of officers together, like it's part of some kind of organized response. All of this makes combat in Red Dead 2 feel way more lethal. Another really interesting and realistic detail about the lawmen is what happens when the player goes too deep in shootouts and leaves more bodies than usual behind. After the chase is over, you can actually see the officers loading the bodies, both victims and fellow officers, onto a horse. It's an incredible detail. Next time you're in Red Dead, try it out. Start a wild shootout in town, then hide somewhere nearby. You'll see the cops cleaning up the mess you left behind, hauling away the bodies. Now that we've talked about how law worked in smaller and less prepared towns, we can move on to the big modern cities. There's a big contrast between the modern Saint Denis and smaller towns like Valentine or Rhodes. In Saint Denis, they had standardized uniforms as far back as the 1820s, following the models used in Boston and New York. So yeah, unlike the smaller towns, there they had proper uniforms, which made it a lot easier to organize and identify officers. There's even that mission where Arthur dresses up as a cop. But hang on, we'll talk a bit more about Saint Denis Police Force soon, because there are definitely a few things the game could have done better there. Now listen, I swear I'm running out of ways to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. So I made NPCs rain from the sky just to get your attention. You've made it this far and still haven't liked or subscribed, and please take a second and hit that subscribe button. We've got this bold goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers and I'd really appreciate your support. Alright, let's go back to the video. Frontier justice was brutal and raw, with authoritarian sheriffs, like the Sheriff of Tumbleweed for example, who enforced their own version of the law, following their own rules without caring much about what people thought or even what the law actually said.
Make your peace, partner.
The boy was gonna put me in a cell!
This is wartime, and like you said,
No!
we can't take the risk.
In that time, border lawmen were super corrupt and extremely violent, and Rockstar shows that pretty accurately, especially when you look at the whole Tumbleweed area. It's a really rough place, full of violent gangs and crooked authorities. You'll often catch scenes where they arrest someone, judge them, and carry out the sentence in a matter of seconds. So yeah, back then, the US border was a violent place and lawmen there were seriously corrupt. In general, corruption in the Old West law system was huge, and we'll dig into that a bit more in a second. Now, the game's wanted system is one of the most debated features in Red Dead 2, and probably one of the biggest breaks from real life. But it was clearly designed with gameplay in mind, not realism. Game devs often have to make choices that don't reflect real life but make the experience more fun. After all, you're playing a simulation of the Wild West, not actually living in it. The thing is, sometimes the wanted system feels a little too perfect. Any little disturbance and suddenly you've got 100 cops shooting at you, just because you bumped into a random NPC. Okay, maybe not just bumping into someone, but still.
What about you?
The point is, the wanted system is way more efficient than what police forces in 1899 were actually capable of. In reality, communication was super limited. While bigger cities had telegraph systems and cowboys, like in Saint Denis, rural areas had to rely on messengers on horseback. If you committed a crime out in the middle of nowhere, it could take days or even weeks for the news to spread or for reinforcements to show up and deal with it. The endless waves of cops magically appearing in remote areas, like what happens in the game, is totally unrealistic. Sometimes when you commit a crime in the middle of nowhere, the law doesn't even notice, just like how there might not be any witnesses around to report it. And I've got to admit, in some specific situations, the cops really don't get alerted when you're out in remote areas. Not every crime committed in the wilderness made its way back to the authorities. Real sheriffs back then operated with tiny budgets and barely had any structure. Their manpower was extremely limited. Most jurisdictions had maybe 2 or 3 officers covering hundreds of square kilometers. But it's understandable in the context of the game. Players need to be challenged if they commit serious crimes in the cities. Still, I'll admit, the number of cops that come after you can be kind of insane sometimes. Luckily, after a while, they do stop spawning. Now, let's talk about Saint Denis again. There are officers on almost every corner, and in the wealthier parts of Saint Denis, policing is even more heavy-handed. You'll see that the officers are well dressed, in full uniform, equipped with proper gear and repeaters. The thing is, the game ends up making the cops look way more professional than they actually were back then. Back in 1899, cops in places like Saint Denis had basically no formal training. New recruits were handed a baton, a whistle, and a key to the call box. Those were common in big cities. Then they'd be paired with a more experienced officer for a few days, and that was pretty much it. The veteran would share a few tips here and there, but there wasn't any structured training or ranking system. It was pretty much anyone willing to help enforce the law. If you look closely at the uniforms the officers wear in Saint Denis, you'll notice they do carry a baton on their belt, but we never actually see them use it in the game. Still, it's an accurate replica of the gear from that era. Now, like I mentioned earlier, one thing Rockstar kinda overlooked is that cities like Saint Denis should have had call boxes. These were early telephones or telegraph stations spread throughout the city. During things like bank robberies or major incidents, someone would be in charge of alerting headquarters using these call boxes. They were basically like street-side telegraphs, but the game rarely shows this kind of tech being used for police coordination. That makes sense for rural areas, which is where most of the game takes place, obviously. Still, it kinda underestimates how connected law enforcement was becoming in more urban and developed areas like Saint Denis. Technology was moving way faster than Red Dead 2 suggests. By 1899, major cities already had fairly advanced communication systems. Chicago, for example, installed call boxes back in 1880, and police departments around the country were linked by telegraph networks. The late 19th century was definitely the end of a legendary era for the world. The decaying Old West of America was desperately trying to modernize its law enforcement and sense of order. Outlaws like Dutch's gang were no longer accepted or tolerated. America needed law and order. The Vanderlande gang itself represents real-life outlaw groups that operated in poorly policed territories. Gangs like Butch Cassidy's were legitimate threats that law enforcement struggled to deal with on a daily basis. The law enforcement structure portrayed in Red Dead 2 has a small, lean hierarchy that was still figuring out how to apply the law across the country. At the top of the pyramid, you had the US Marshals, federal agents with extraordinary power across vast territories. Below them were county sheriffs, like the Sheriff of Valentine, for example. And then you had the Deputies, basically the everyday lawmen, kind of like we have today, and the game shows this structure really well in several missions. For instance, in the mission where the gang arrives in Rhodes, they start helping out the local lawmen, especially the Sheriff of Rhodes. And during the conversation with the gang, the Sheriff quickly introduces his deputies, his regular officers who help enforce the law on a daily basis. What's funny is that Arthur and even other members of the gang end up becoming deputies at one point, and back then that was actually pretty common. Ordinary people could be appointed as lawmen, just like that, and we're gonna learn more about how that worked a bit later. Now, besides the traditional police force we're already familiar with, there was also a private agency known as the Pinkertons. And yeah, that's shown pretty well in Red Dead 2. The Pinkerton agents in the game, like Milton and Ross, were federal agents with authority that extended across multiple territories. But here's the thing, they were a private agency. usually hired by railroad barons or wealthy folks who wanted strict law enforcement and the end of the outlaw gangs causing all kinds of trouble. One detail Red Dead 2 kind of overlooks is that the Pinkertons weren't as powerful as the game makes them seem. Yes, they could investigate and track down criminals, just like they do in the game, but they didn't have legal authority to make arrests. They had to call in the local law enforcement to actually carry out an arrest. So yeah, the Pinkertons were known for trying to strike deals, just like we see in the game, where they repeatedly try to bribe key members of the gang. But they didn't have nearly as much power as the game suggests. Of course, Agent Milton and Agent Ross come off as a bit corrupt. They don't really care much about the legal limits they were supposed to follow back then. The truth is, 1899 was way more chaotic than Red Dead 2 makes it seem. Police corruption wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Officers regularly took bribes to look the other way, and police departments were basically controlled by local political bosses. It was straight up chaos. Equipment was extremely primitive. Most officers didn't even carry firearms regularly until the late 1800s. Supervisors had no way to track what their men were doing. The danger was very real. In fact, in 1899 alone, at least 107 law enforcement officers died in line of duty. Most of them were shot. It was definitely a dangerous job. Another thing people often assume is that the Old West was a lawless place where everyone carried a gun all the time. But the truth is, some towns actually required new arrivals to check their weapons at the local sheriff's office before entering. Not all towns had that rule, of course, but it did exist. Most people did own some kind of firearm for self-defense, especially to protect their property. Now we've got to talk about the bounty hunters. Bounty hunters are also one of the more distorted figures from the Old West. Yes, they really did exist back then, but they were way less important compared to the actual lawmen of the time. Most bounties in the year the game takes place were actually claimed by the police themselves. That's right, officers could collect bounties on outlaws as a way to earn a little extra cash. Bounty hunters were rare, and some were even looked down on. The main difference between a bounty hunter and a police officer was the way they could operate. For example, a bounty hunter wasn't restricted by things like national borders. He could cross into Mexico without the same legal barriers. And of course, they had no problem trespassing on private property, if that's what it took to catch someone. After all, they weren't playing by the same rules as the lawmen. Why do you think the Pinkertons sent John into Mexico in the first game? Even capturing a criminal within the same state already involved a ton of red tape. Now imagine trying to arrest someone in another country back then. That's exactly the kind of thing a bounty hunter could pull off without much trouble. Another issue with how police are portrayed in Red Dead 2 is that by that time, the United States was already divided into states. That means each state in the game would technically have its own laws and jurisdiction. In the game, they perfectly respect that aspect. Yes, in Red Dead 2, the lawmen actually do respect state jurisdiction. They don't just chase you across state borders, which lines up perfectly with the game's wanted system, where you can have different bounty amounts in different states. The term bounty hunter didn't even become popular until the 1950s. Back in the time Red Dead 2 takes place, they were usually referred to as deputized men. Another thing that's often distorted by Hollywood movies is the actual value of bounties for capturing criminals. In the era when Red Dead 2 is set, the average bounty was about $100, which, adjusted for today's money, would be around $3,000. In one of the missions, Agent Ross even mentions that Arthur has a $5,000 bounty on his head.
You're a wanted man, Mr. Morgan. It's $5,000 for your head
which
alone.
for that time would be absolutely massive. Adjusted to today's values, that $5,000 bounty would be nearly $200,000. Sure, those numbers are probably a bit inflated in the game, but it's clearly meant to show just how dangerous Arthur was. Another issue is how the game and old movies make it seem like wanted posters were everywhere back then. In reality, reward posters were super bureaucratic and often weren't even issued by law enforcement. A lot of the time, bounty hunters couldn't even claim the reward. There were all sorts of challenges, like simply proving the identity of the suspect. Sometimes they ended up capturing the wrong person. And then there was the bureaucracy of a young and already corrupt justice system. Being a bounty hunter was no easy life, and most of the time it probably wasn't even worth it. As the sheriff of Valentine puts it, you don't send a saint to catch a sinner. There are other details that Hollywood has distorted too. According to experts, people who carried guns back then didn't wear their holsters hanging as low as we see in games or Western films. In Red Dead 2, they went for the classic Hollywood-style holster setup. but in real life, holsters were usually worn higher up on the waist, which made horseback riding way easier. Another detail experts point out is the famous saloon doors. Hollywood loves to romanticize those swinging doors, but they weren't nearly as common as movies and games make them seem. Very few saloons actually used that kind of door. Most had regular full doors, especially to help keep out the cold. I mean, imagine a freezing town with just those little doors out front. Doesn't make much sense, right? So yeah, those aren't exactly realistic. When criminals were caught, they were usually held in small, simple cells, often inside modest buildings that acted as temporary jails, especially when the offense wasn't too serious. Those little jails often doubled as the sheriff's living space too. In Valentine, for example, Red Dead 2 shows a basic setup where someone could stay overnight watching the prisoners, with beds, a fireplace for warmth, and just the bare essentials. Must have been rough sleeping while a prisoner stared you down from across the room. And yeah, they usually didn't waste much time transferring dangerous criminals, because if they waited too long,
You coming, buddy?
Also, the small jail cells found in little towns and even in bigger cities like Saint Denis weren't exactly the best. Most of them didn't even have the basic necessities to hold someone for long sentences. If the crime was more serious, the prisoner would be transferred to a maximum security prison, like Sisika, where we rescue John Marston in one of the game's missions. Hangings were also a real form of execution back then, especially in the states where Red Dead 2 takes place. Over time, these executions were moved inside the prisons, mainly after laws were passed to stop the public from turning them into bloody spectacles. Yeah, watching people die used to be a form of entertainment. Red Dead is honestly such a fascinating game. The video showing up on your left is where I break down electricity in the Red Dead 2 era, and some other super interesting details. And the one on your right, that's me talking about Liberty City Metro System in GTA 4. So don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because I know you've been watching all the videos and still haven't subscribed.